there, art nerds. I have another start to finish blank page to finish watercolor sketch illustration for you guys today. So grab your pencils, grab your paintbrushes, and grab your inking pens because I am going to take you from the start to the finish of this strawberry girl illustration. If you guys enjoy these start to finish tutorials, make sure you let me know loud and proud down in the comments below because I really do appreciate your feedback and your positive encouragement. It would also mean a lot to me if you shared it with a friend who's interested in drawing, inking, or watercolor painting. So let's get ready to start sketching. This sketch is going to be done in my Canson XL watercolor sketchbook, and I am sketching it with red Pentel lead in a Muji mechanical pencil. I already had a thumbnail illustration sketched out to give me an idea of what I wanted the illustration to look like, and I have that off to the side. So I'm starting by lightly sketching out a stick figure of the girl, and if you're looking for more how to draw people tutorials, I've got a bunch of them here on the channel where I walk you through this process more in depth. This sort of stick figure is really helpful for kind of just setting the initial pose, figuring out all the proportions, and kind of getting everything blocked out on the page. If you've ever started drawing a person and you ran out of room either with the head or with the feet, this sort of stick figure will help prevent that from happening in the future. So I want her to hold a strawberry. So one of the tricks I found for drawing people is before I actually draw in the arms, I draw in the object they're interacting with, and then I kind of connect the two using the stick figures of the arms. And that makes drawing the arms a lot easier than drawing the arms and then trying to place the object in it, since typically we wrap our arms around what we're trying to hold. Now I am trying to keep everything fairly loose because this red lead doesn't erase the best, and I've got a lot of details that I want to add in on top, but I did want to draw it dark enough for you guys to be able to see it. So I have kind of blocked in the main body, blocked in the main figure, and I've done that using volumetric construction or volumetric figure drawing, which is another thing that I have a lot of great tutorials on that'll walk you through the process more in depth. Next, I'm blocking in the face. I'm having a little bit of trouble capturing exactly the expression that I wanted, so I'm going to end up redrawing it a few times. On that note, I also have many tutorials on drawing faces, particularly cartoony faces. I'll try to remember to link everything for you guys down in the description below, but it did take a few passes for me to get it exactly the way I wanted it to be. I've also kind of started blocking in her clothing as well as the strawberries down by her feet, and she's a Lilliputian, so everything is going to be really large in relation to her size. So for the concept, I wanted her to wear like a blue gingham dress with a little straw sun hat, and that's kind of what I'm working on. I've got some reference going on my monitor behind the desk because you guys know me, even though I have a cartoony art style, I really like to work with a lot of reference. I like to have a really good idea of what I'm drawing and not just rely on my imagination for real world objects. Even for really simple poses like this one, I find doing constructive human anatomy to be really helpful, and I try not to skip too many of the steps unless I'm just really short on time. This is particularly useful if you're just getting used to the concept. It can take a little bit of practice and a little while to get used to it, so I would recommend drawing everything all the way out every time you draw it and then erasing or covering up what you don't need. I've also blocked in her dress using some pretty simple forms. I'm kind of thinking of it in triangular shapes, and once I've got everything kind of blocked in, then I can start refining some of the details. Now I am going to ink this, so I don't want to like overkill it and add too many details, so I'm not that worried about it because I'm going to do that in ink. Even though I've kept everything fairly light except for kind of finalizing my details with a heavier pass of lead, I am going to erase the details that I don't need and kind of clean everything up. I'm adding in some ruffles now. Mostly I do that by adding kind of a squiggly line at the bottom of the tier, and then I kind of add in some lines connecting the two tiers to one another. Here's my finished sketch. If you don't necessarily feel like drawing along with me today, I am going to share a scan of the line art with my patrons over on Patreon, so you can print it out and paint along with me. You can find me at patreon.com/nattosoup. Next up is inking. I'm inking with a Sakura Pigma FB brush pen. This is one of my favorite brush pens to use because it is waterproof and alcohol marker proof. And what I really love about brush pens is with a little bit of practice, you can do a wide variety of different line art widths. So you don't really need like a bunch of technical pens. And I just find it easier for me to use than technical pens. I don't have any kind of relationship with Sakura. I just happen to really like this brush pen, and it's one that I use all the time. You see it pop up in lots of my videos. I also have a white sheet of copier paper underneath my hand that is to prevent the wet ink from smearing. This brush pen doesn't really put down a lot of super wet ink, but if you're working on a less absorbent paper like a Bristol, then smearing is pretty common, and this kind of buffer sheet is just really helpful for preventing my hand from smearing and preventing me from making little like ink prints all over the paper. When I'm inking, I tend to work from the most important thing to the least important thing, and when I'm drawing faces and people, you guessed it, it's the face. And the reason I do this is because I want to catch it while my hand is still fresh and before I get all worn out, because that's the area where if I'm going to make a mistake, people are the most likely to notice it. So when it comes to inking, I really just try to take my time. I try to relax. And this took about 30 minutes to ink. This video, pretty much all of the portions of it have been sped up by 4x, and I've removed all the dry times and things like this. So if you're painting along, be patient with yourself. Art takes time to make, even fun, cute sketchbook art like this. And I'm basically working my way down from the face down to her feet. And I'm also going to do areas that overlap one another first. So for example, I'll probably do her arms before I do the strawberry, and I'll probably do the strawberry before I do the dress underneath the strawberry. Inking is one of the parts of the process that at this point you probably could skip. You could probably go straight in with watercolor on top of your colored line art. I mean, we've done that here on the channel plenty of times, but I like to ink because it gives me something that I can share with my patrons. It gives me an option for a coloring sheet, and I just find the process to be really relaxing for me. I also like how the inks kind of tie these sketchbook watercolor illustrations together. It just adds this layer of completion and kind of tightens things up in a way that I find really pleasing. But if you don't want to ink your sketch, you absolutely do not have to. And again, if you just want to paint along with me, you can find the line art over on my Patreon. With the strawberries, I'm going to ink the seeds first, and I'm going to use a really light hand with that. And then I'm going to go around and ink the exterior of the strawberries with a heavier hand and a bit of a heavier line art. And like I mentioned earlier, with brush pens, the heavier you push down, the harder you push down, the thicker the line weight is going to be. And this is great for denoting heavy objects, for indicating objects that are in the foreground, for indicating important objects, or for drawing a bit of a shadow on the side of the object that is away from the light source. So I think brush pens are just really flexible and useful for the kind of art that I like to make. Now, one thing that might be kind of nerve-wracking, but I find it has made me a much stronger artist and a much stronger inker, is that I cannot fix mistakes in ink until after we've painted it because it's going to be super noticeable. So I either have to find a way to make it work in the inks or learn to live with my mistakes and try to cover them up in the watercolor. And this has made me a much more confident inker because you just have to learn to roll with things and to not expect perfection and to just be happy when good enough is good enough. And that can be really freeing because perfect is the enemy of finished. Once I've finished inking this illustration, I'm going to let the inks cure to the paper for 24 hours, scan it, and then we can start watercoloring it. All right, are you guys ready to paint? Because I'm ready to paint. Just one more reminder that you guys can find the printable line art on my Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup. So I am painting with my ginormous mega palette today, and I am using a rose ceramic palette that has a whole bunch of little wells. This is really useful for doing character art like this. And I wanted to create kind of a cool summery blue sky for the background. So I mixed a little bit of cerulean blue with some French ultramarine. Now, if you were painting along with me today, you can use whatever colors make your heart sing. You can use whatever paints you have on hand and happen to like. You can use whatever brushes and whatever paper, because this is all about encouraging you to make art and hopefully inspiring you to make art by sharing some tricks and some tutorials and some ideas with you guys to get you guys motivated and making art, because I definitely believe that everybody has it in them, and sometimes we just need a little extra inspiration. So that's why I have so many tutorials on so many different drawing and painting and comic topics to inspire and encourage you guys to pick up a pencil, pick up a pen, or pick up a paintbrush and make some art. So I have filled that circle that we sketched in with red with our cerulean and ultramarine blue mix. I'm using some Chinese watercolor weights to weigh down my sketchbook just so that it doesn't buckle. You can find those over on Amazon. I'll have all the materials that I used for today's tutorial in the description below. Most of them are going to be Amazon affiliate links, so if you use my links, that is a great way to support the channel, buying stuff you might buy anyway at no extra cost to you. So I want her dress to be a blue gingham, which means it's going to have a white base. So I am starting out with a really light wash to paint the shadows of our white with some ultramarine blue. And I'm also doing this for the strawberry flower on her bonnet. So we are painting on cellulose paper today. That is an inexpensive watercolor paper. It's a sketchbook grade paper. Not the best, but I like painting on cellulose paper from time to time. And the thing about cellulose paper is it's not going to absorb the water and it's not going to really absorb the pigment. So everything is going to sit on the surface of your paper. And that means you kind of have to adjust how you handle your watercolors. So I would recommend fewer layers, keeping it simple, keeping your colors more saturated, because they are going to dry more desaturated on this paper, and there's less you can kind of do to fix that. Don't worry about doing too many glazes. Don't worry about doing too much with shadows. This is really great for more immediate, more vibrant watercolor that's just more for fun and not necessarily so rendered out or thought out. I painted this illustration mostly over the course of an evening, let it dry, and then came back to it the next morning just to add some final details. So it's a quicker paper to paint on, partially because of its limitations, which can make it really freeing when you're so used to these big, heavily rendered, fairly mannered illustrations on cotton rag paper. So if you only ever paint on cotton rag, I would recommend trying out some cellulose and just playing around with it and seeing how you feel about it. So I did another layer of our cerulean blue and ultramarine because the color wasn't quite as saturated as I initially wanted it. I'm going in and kind of cleaning some of those areas up with a brush of clean water and a paper towel just to pick some of that blue up. So on cellulose papers like this, lifting is much easier, maybe too easy. So if you make mistakes in watercolor, it can be easier to correct them. I'm also going in with another layer of our ultramarine blue shadow, kind of building those shadows up. Right now I'm just kind of blocking it in because I don't necessarily want any of her dress to be the white of the paper. Once I've built the shadows on her dress up enough, I am going to add a little bit of shadow to the underside of her sun hat, and then I'm going to mix her skin tone. And I was going to make her a redhead, so we're going with some yellow ochre with a little bit of burnt sienna and then a little bit of rose d'or so that we get kind of a peachy skin tone for this. And I could use Jaune Brilliant. I've got a couple of them in my palette, as you guys can see. I actually don't really like using those pre-mixed skin tones that have a lot of white in them as skin tones. I prefer to use those on highlights on darker skin tones to add a little bit of rim lighting. So I'm going to block in her skin tone using our really light mix of skin tone first, allow that to dry, and then we can start developing our forms and our shadows. So as I mentioned earlier, cellulose paper doesn't necessarily absorb a lot of the water or the pigments, which can be both a good thing and a bad thing. If you have the humidity really low in your house or you're painting in a low humidity area, then it dries very quickly, which can make it harder to do wet into wet, but it does mean you can finish a watercolor illustration a bit more quickly. I live in Southeast Louisiana. We always have the AC on, so my dry times are actually pretty short, but you may want a longer, more open dry time because that can mean when you're applying a large wash like we did to the oval in the background, a longer dry time, a longer open time will mean it's less streaky. However, these shorter dry times are really working to my benefit because this is a sketchbook illustration that I'm sharing with you guys, and we're kind of working through the process, and I'm trying to finish up a sketchbook. So I want it to dry quicker because I'm not looking to do this really rendered, really layered, wet into wet illustration. So that means that I can start painting the skin tone, the second layer of skin tone, where I'm starting to block in some of the shadows. And I know it's kind of hard to see. I apologize. I do, however, have some great tutorials on not only mixing skin tones, but figuring out the zones of the face and where you might want to add shadow if you have a cartoony art style like I do. I will link them for you guys down in the description below. Consider this a gateway to a bunch of great, more in-depth watercolor tutorials that'll really help you start painting people with confidence, because that's my goal. I want there to be more cartoony artists out there, especially in watercolor. So I added another layer of shadow to our gingham dress, mostly focusing now on the areas that would be further away from the light source. So the ruffles as they go in, the areas underneath her arms, and the strawberry. I also added some blue to her eyes. That's one of my favorite colors to use as a shadow color for eyes, regardless of the eye color, is either like a Payne's gray, a phthalo blue, or an ultramarine blue, kind of depending on the light situation in the illustration. So we've got another layer of skin tone. Now, one thing, since this is such an immediate painting and it really doesn't take that much time, usually if I'm painting like a larger illustration on cotton rag, I'm going to allow the paints to naturally evaporate and kind of saturate as I go. So with this, I actually have to keep mixing my skin tone a little bit darker, and sometimes it can be difficult to color match or to kind of keep in the same vein of the same color. So you may wish to swatch as you go. I added a little bit of Rose d'Or mixed with alizarin crimson to her cheeks to start creating the blush. And I'm going to add that to her cheeks, the tops of her eyes, the underside of her nose, her lips, underneath her chin, her fingertips, her palms, her elbows. If you guys could see her knees, it would be on her knees. Basically, anywhere you would want to add blush naturally. So like cheeks or lips, or anywhere skin is kind of crossing skin. So now that I've got her skin tone kind of going, I'm going to start on the straw hat, and I'm using a Quin Gold for this, really watered down to kind of capture the gold qualities of a straw hat without too much of the opacity from a yellow ochre. I'm also trying to use my brush to really indicate the texture of a straw hat as well, doing kind of little stippling motions. For the strawberries with this one, I'm going to start with quinacridone red or Holbein cherry red. You guys might remember from our strawberry painting tutorial that there's a few different methods of how you can handle it. I'm going to keep this one much more simple than that big illustration of just the strawberries. So I'm starting with kind of a cooler, pinker red that has kind of like a candy feel to it so that we can really kind of capture the juicy, reddish color that you get with strawberries. And naturally, I am referencing as I go. So for this one, I'm not going to pull out the masking fluid. We're just going to add white for the seeds later on. I'm going in with a more saturated version of our cherry red, leaving some highlights on our strawberries of the initial color that we put down first. And I'm going to repeat this with all of our strawberries, making sure to leave that highlight. I'm cheating and mostly leaving it at the top, kind of the top rounded part of the strawberries, but you can put it wherever you feel your light source is going to be. And I paint primarily with round watercolor brushes and quills. I find them to be really versatile and really easy to just kind of get the effects that I want to get. So that's what I'm using and that's what I'm comfortable with. I'm mostly painting with silver black velvet watercolor brushes, as well as probably a Diane W quill in there and maybe a Paul Rubens quill. So with watercolor, you don't necessarily want to render any one area all the way out to completion, which can make doing tutorials a little bit challenging because we're jumping around a whole lot. We're coloring a bunch of different areas. But the nice thing about this is it really kind of helps you keep the contrast in mind, keep the detail in mind, keep the shading in mind so that you're not having to go back and correct anything too much. I'm going in with some alizarin crimson and I'm adding some additional shadows to our strawberries. I'm also adding in kind of like a long oval mark, really relying on my brush for this, for the areas where the seeds are, because if you guys look at strawberries, you'll notice the seeds are, at least on a mature strawberry, the seeds are often in a little indent. So I wanted to make sure that I captured that here. mixed in a little bit of naphthalide maroon with maybe a little bitty bit of diox purple, and I'm going to use that for the darkest shadows on our strawberries. And I'm trying to cover a little bit less with each layer so that we can really build up those colors and we get that contrast and we're developing those forms. That took a little bit of time to dry. So once it had a chance to dry, I'm coming in now and I'm going to start mixing our red hair. And I'm going to start with an undercoat or an under layer of kind of a blondish yellowish tone. And that's going to be our highlight with our red hair. Going in with a little bit more golden yellow here, and we're going to start to start developing it and kind of building up that hair color, grabbing a little bit of orange and adding that in. So I've got like Chinese orange with a little bit of gamboge to start, building up. And I was thinking more like a carrot top rather than like a darker red. I'm just kind of a sucker for like the really bright red hair colors. So I wanted to kind of have a chance to paint that here because it's something that can be a little bit tricky for me, and it's something I wanted to get a little bit more experience with. And I'm definitely getting some strong Tiny Anne of Green Gables vibes here. Maybe that's what I was secretly channeling, although instead of the braids, we've got kind of a bobble hair situation going on. At this point, I'm probably adding in a little bit of scarlet so that we can get some of that red in there. If you guys ever look really closely at red hair, it's actually got all of these different hair colors mixed in, and that's what kind of creates the illusion. And it's just such a pretty hair color, and I wanted to really capture that. So I'm also grabbing a little bit of brown so that we can start painting in some of the shadows and lowlights on the hair to give it a little bit more definition. And I grabbed a little bit of Van Dyke brown with a little bit of red on the same brush to accomplish that. Adding in some Queen Gold, probably mixed with a little bit of burnt sienna so that we can start really delineating the straw texture on the straw hat. And I did that particularly on the underside of the brim to also start building up that shadow. And now we can actually start the gingham pattern. So I'm using the same cerulean blue that I did for the background. It's had a chance to evaporate and saturate, so it's a darker color. And I'm painting all of my stripes going in one direction first. And I'm trying to follow the flow of the fabric, and that includes when it kind of gets caught up in these folds. So visually, if we just look at this as a flat surface, some of these stripes are going to be closer to other stripes than they would be if the fabric was just flat, and that's because they're getting caught up in those folds. So surface design, surface painting, especially with really simple patterns like this one, can be a great way to give your fabric designs some form and to really indicate to the viewer what's going on with the fabric, especially these kind of cross contour and contour patterns. And on that note, in my How to Draw Anything series, I talk a lot about drawing fabric and fabric folds. So if you're interested in learning how to draw fabric, I hope you guys will check that series out as well. And there's a lot that you can take from that you can apply to drawing patterns on fabric when you're, clothing your characters. Once that first layer of our cerulean blue dried, I'm going in and doing a cross contour horizontal layer with the same color. And the reason I allowed it to dry is because we're going to get some optical blending where the two colors, well, it's the same color, but the two layers of that color on top of each other create the illusion of a slightly darker blue, which works a lot like how in weaving where you have the warp and the weft, and when they cross over, they can create a secondary color, or they can create a more solid version of the color, which appears darker to the viewer. This watercolor illustration is almost done. We're adding some finishing touches, but we still need to paint her eyes and the tops of the strawberries. And for that, I am starting with a really cool yellow. It might even be Sennelier's yellow green, but I believe it is bismuth yellow. And I'm painting the tops of the strawberries with that. That's going to be our lightest color. And I really love using yellows with hooker green and with phthalo blue, because you can get these really bright and vibrant foliage greens that really just seem to pop and have a lot of life. I used a little bit of hooker's green for her eyes, and now I'm going to start painting another layer on the strawberry tops once they had a chance to dry. So we are glazing one color on top of the other and hopefully still retaining some of the freshness that we had with the initial yellow. So with a cellulose paper like this kind of glazing technique is not as successful as it would be on a cotton rag paper. That's why I want to really talk about the differences between the two paper, and I do have videos where I talk about those in great depth, because I think both types of paper have their place for watercolor artists. Both serve a purpose, and choosing the right paper for you and for your project can really make a big difference in how it turns out and how you feel about it. Cellulose paper is much more economical. It's cheaper, easier to find than a cotton rag paper. I mean, you could go down to Michael's and get Canson XL. You used to be able to go to Walmart and find it. So it's the type of paper that a lot of people grab first when they're starting out with watercolor. And while it's not necessarily the best fit for most projects, it definitely has its place, especially for watercolor sketches. So I would almost recommend cellulose paper for more advanced watercolor artists, or people who understand that it's going to have different properties and understand how to change their painting style to suit it. Now I say this, but I paint watercolor comics. That's what got me into watercolor, and I paint them on Canson Montval, which is also a cellulose paper. So I have probably painted more on cellulose than I have on cotton rag, just by sheer bulk of painting hundreds of watercolor comic pages. So I can say full chested that both paper types have their place and have their use, and it's important to figure out what uses you want to use them for and how they're going to bring out the best in your art. And that's one of the reasons I talk about and I review art supplies so much here on the channel, is because there are bad art supplies, but it isn't so much about there being bad art supplies. It's about there being art supplies that are good for you and your use case. And as a watercolor comic artist, I don't really see a lot of what I do here on YouTube outside of what I do. So I think it's really important to talk about it from that viewpoint. So this kind of illustration would be more in line with what I do for watercolor comics than like my more illustration-y on cotton rag paper watercolor style. So I did another layer of our cerulean blue and ultramarine blue from the beginning, because I really wanted the background to just be darker to provide a little bit more contrast for her. You guys can see how streaky that is. That's the cellulose paper. It just doesn't hold on to pigment and water the same way a cotton rag would. It does not bother me because I know what I'm painting on. I'm fine with that. And this is kind of like an elevated watercolor sketch. So I'm good with it, but I'm pointing it out to you guys in case you were hoping to get like a perfect wash. That is going to be really challenging to do on a cotton rag paper like this. I'm also going in with a little bit more of our hooker's green and just adding in some darker, more saturated low lights to kind of create those shadows and to kind of create that delineation on those strawberry tops. Once everything's had a chance to dry, I'm going to pull out my white gouache and use it to add some white highlights here and there. So you guys will probably notice that this illustration isn't as detailed. I didn't do as many layers. It doesn't have as much shadow. It doesn't have as much contrast as my more rendered out watercolor illustrations. I'm good with that. I had a lot of fun painting this. It was kind of a refreshing change of pace. It went a lot quicker. I think it'll be easier for you guys to paint along with because we're mostly sticking to local color and various saturations of that local color. So I had a lot of fun painting this. I hope you guys had fun hanging out with me today. I have more start to finish watercolor tutorials for you guys, so I hope you guys will join me for that. If you're new here, hi, hello, welcome. I'm Becca Hilburn. I'm a watercolor artist and comic artist. I make the watercolor comic 7-inch Kara. You can read that at 7inchkara.com for free, or if you're a fan of the dead tree format like I am a book hoarder. You can order copies at natosoup.com/shop. It is full of positive ADHD representation. So if you have ADHD or if somebody else you love has ADHD, I think you guys will really enjoy 7-inch Kara. Huge thank you once again to my amazing patrons. They make tutorials like this one possible, and I shared the line art with them in case any of them would like to paint along. You can join me for just $2 a month at patreon.com/natosoup. Check the description below for the materials and additional tutorials, and check out some of these cool playlists and videos. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you guys again soon. Bye guys!